thanks for having me. I am William Chapman. I'm the Oregon Statewide Interoperability Coordinator. And my presentation, Out of the Pandemic and Into the Wildfires, will take a look at how the state of Oregon supports large-scale incident management during emergencies, and particularly around how we support communications. So, but again, thanks for having me here at the Comm Academy. Really excited to be here. Just a little bit about me, where I come from. I've been in Oregon for about a year and a half. I come from the great state of Arizona. I've spent most of my career in public safety in one form or another. I started off in the fire service. I've done some law enforcement work. I ran a dispatch center for about 10 years. I've been an EMT since I was 18. I'm married to my beautiful wife, Catherine. That's a picture of her up in the upper right-hand corner. She's a school teacher here in Salem. And then I've been the SWIC with the state of Oregon for about a year and a half now, and I can say that it has been an exciting year and a half. But for me, it's been a really exciting career. Being able to look at all different aspects of incident management, from the time the 911 call comes in through actually responding out to the emergency, and then back in the station, the report writing aspects, and then also kind of understanding how communications affects all of those different pieces of the response has kind of led me to where I am today, and I couldn't be happier than being where I am today. So the most common question that I get before we get down into the nitty-gritty of the presentation is, what's a SWIC? SWIC stands for Statewide Interoperability Coordinator. And in Oregon, I'm established under our state's Chief Information Officer. Previously, the position was under our state police, and then it was moved over to emergency management, and then transportation, and now I reside under the state CIO. But my job is to work with public safety, multi-agency, cross-governmental organization called the SIEC, or State Interoperability Executive Council, and to work with them to promulgate and implement the State Communications Interoperability Plan, or SCIP. SCIPs are common in all 56 states and territories, but they kind of set that strategy for how the state moves towards interoperable communications. I, like all SWICs, also serve as a member of the National Council of SWICs, kind of a peer-based organization where we get together and share different aspects of communications and interoperability across the state, and see what everybody else is doing. So my job's really about 6 things. It's primarily about program management and governance. We manage different communications projects and programs, things like radio systems and alerts and warning systems. We help develop governance around emergency communications. We do outreach and education and policy development. And then again, a big part of my job, called out in statute, is to go out and implement our SCIP. But what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about today is kind of an aspect of being a SWIC that we don't get to talk about a whole lot, and that's the emergency response aspect. Actually kind of going out and being those boots on the ground, leading communications efforts at the state level. Real quick, just a little bit about our SIEC, and Washington has an SIEC as well. So some of this information carries over for Washington and other states. But in Oregon, our SIEC is made up of 22 members from different public safety sectors. We've got some associations members. We've got some legislatures, some state agency folks. We look at a number of different things, but we try and approach communications all the different aspects of the ecosystem. So the 911 call, the land mobile radio systems, public safety broadband, and alerts and warnings. And that view has really kind of informed how I, as the SWIC, approach everything. So when we start talking about communications, it's not just LMR systems, it's not just broadband, it's not just internet, not just cell towers. It's everything. So from the time the call goes out till the time people are back at the station and the call is over. So I'll pivot now and kind of get into the bread and butter of my presentation here about emergency response and how we support that at the state level. But I wanted to start off with one of my favorite quotes around disasters and emergencies. Disaster doesn't just sort us out by preference. It drags us into emergencies that require we act and act altruistically, bravely, and with initiative in order to survive or save the neighbor, no matter how we vote or what we do for a living. So one of my colleagues over at the Oregon Office of Emergency Management shared this with me, and it's actually from a book about the philosophy of responding to disasters and large-scale emergencies. And the author, Rebecca Sohint, her thesis is that regardless of how bad an emergency is, there are good things about the response. People come together, they put aside their differences, they figure it out, how to move past that. And I thought that was really powerful to me, and something that I have seen time and time again, both on the public safety side and now more on the emergency management side. So I just wanted to share that with everybody, and I thought that was pretty meaningful. So another question that I get asked a lot is, what is ESF2? ESF stands for Emergency Support Function. Oregon, the state of Oregon, operates an emergency coordination center as opposed to an emergency operations center that you see a lot of states run with. But our coordination center, we are made up of ESFs. So each of the ESF is typically led by one or more agencies, and our job is to support the state's response. The ESFs are broken up by function or core capability. So 1 is transportation, 2 is communications, 3 is public works, 4 is firefighting, and so on and so forth. But in Oregon, communications is led by the SWIC, who works for the Department of Administrative Services, and then my counterpart, who works for the Public Utility Commission. The two of us and our teams are supported by a number of different agencies that you can kind of see listed out on your screen. But our Department of Transportation, who runs our state radio system, our forestry folks, all the way on up to our federal partners from FEMA and CISA, and even our NGOs and nonprofits and VOADs like ITDRC. So a lot of support there, and we kind of focus on this as a whole community effort. And then we, in turn, in ESF2 Communications, we support other ESFs. So, for example, communications is integral in firefighting and law enforcement, and even to some extent ESFs like fuel and transportation. Without communications, they can't carry out their mission. So for ESF2, what we bring to the table, particularly around these large-scale emergencies, are coordination efforts. Most of the time, I don't bring equipment or I don't bring boots-on-the-ground personnel to the fight. I rely on other agencies to do that, and it's my job to coordinate those resources. This year was a little different, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, but one of the things that we have learned in Oregon that works really well for our ESF2 is building that situational awareness and sharing information and building that cross discipline interagency coordination. And we do that through ESF2 coordination calls and launching of Homeland Security Information Network Situational Awareness Room. And you can kind of see some of the examples there on the screen of what our HISN room looks like during an incident. But it's a place where we can post information and have a chat or put together slides or a map like you can see of the fires there. And then on our coordination calls, typically we hold those once or twice a day during an emergency. We bring together everybody who's got a role in communications. So federal, state, local, and tribal response agencies, to our providers on the public sector and private sector. Different associations, contractors, even our utility partners. And that way we get this cross-sector look at what the problem is. And what we found on those coordination calls, when we do it correctly, when we get the right people at the table, we can solve problems on those calls. A utility company needs help getting permits approved so that they can go out and put up poles so that the cell providers can work with the broadband providers to string fiber and get their cell towers back up. When we bring all of the parties that are involved in that process to the table, we can speed that process up. We see even in some cases across the private sector partners that they help each other out. Oh, hey, we need a run of fiber. It's going to take 3 days to get here. We'll see another provider step up and say, you know what, we've got it available. And that kind of goes back to that quote that I shared at the beginning. What we see when we host these calls, it always amazes me, the collaboration and the willingness to just get out there and solve a problem. It really is pretty amazing. And then the other thing we do, and I'll share an example here, is we put out situation reports on communications. So here's an example of what one of our ESF II situation reports look like. You can see that we use the FEMA Lifeline model to kind of put up a very quick, easy way for senior leadership to understand how our portion of the FEMA Lifelines looks. And for us in communications, we are solely tied to the communications lifeline. So this very quickly gives our senior leadership the ability to understand at a high level what's going on, and it allows us to communicate out. And so that's one of the things that we in ESF2 do, is publish these. Allows us to see where deployables are, things like communications unit personnel, how many missions we've responded to, and then goes through kind of a quick overview of what our infrastructure looks like, how our cell networks are doing, any potential impacts that are coming, how alerts and warnings are doing, how 911 is doing, how our emergency responders are able to communicate, whether any of those systems have been impacted. And then interestingly enough, also included in our lifeline is financial systems and people's ability to access their money. It's one of those interdependencies with communications, but if ATMs and banks can't communicate out, then it makes it really hard to get money, which makes it hard to purchase fuel and food and those other necessities for life. So that becomes included in our lifeline as well, and is something we monitor and work with the regulators and different banks and financial institutions on ensuring that people have access to their money during an emergency. So I'll go back to my presentation now. So that was an example of what one of our situation reports looks like. So I promised I would talk a little bit about our response to COVID-19 and the wildfires. And one of the things that I wanted to share right off the bat was what this is all about. The picture on the right-hand side of your screen is of a National Guardsman delivering PPE and masks to telecommunications providers and our 911 centers. And on the left, you'll see a letter that I wrote to some of our team members back kind of in the early days of COVID. But for us at ESF2, this image really captures what our mission is all about. So for those of you that don't know kind of the ins and outs of state government and how we work with the federal government and how we work with the private sector, I won't bore you with the details, but it's suffice to say that it took a lot of coordination and effort for these pieces of equipment to show up where they are needed to do. And in today's day of 1 hour Amazon delivery, we don't think about that. But for us in public safety and emergency management, that photo represents hundreds of hours of coordination. We had to stand up a brand new warehouse to receive the information. We had to figure out where the supplies were needed and how many were needed in each of the communication centers, and how we could get those out there quickly, and what else the centers needed to support so that we could keep that critical service available for the public. And so this, to me, this single photo really summed up what we were about during COVID-19, and that was supporting those who support the public, right? So we had some different taskings and missions during our response to COVID-19. And one of the first was our Office of Emergency Management implemented their Continuity of Operations Plan, or COOP. You can see on the screen what our normal emergency coordination center looks like, and you can see that social distancing in that room might be a little bit of a problem. This is actually a fairly light day when the ECC is activated. There are only a few people standing around, but normally that room is wall to wall, standing room only. It's a very small room. When you think of a state emergency coordination center, you probably picture something much bigger, but this is a fairly small room. And so obviously with COVID-19, we had some challenges on spacing and giving people the ability to work together, but we weren't quite ready to move to a virtual environment or anything like that. So we were tasked with implementing OEM's continuity of operations plan. Our Office of Emergency Management continuity of operations plan involves their agency moving out to a backup site at our Public Safety Academy here in Salem, the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. Unfortunately, that facility and that plan had never been implemented before or tested, and so this move represented some major logistical challenges. And so we kind of put it off for a while. And one of the things that we did was we actually expanded into other areas of the Anderson Readiness Center, where our Office of Emergency Management is held, and that included putting up temporary office space on their drill floor and their gym. And other rooms, breakout rooms, and living areas that they have, and actually allowing people to set up tables and supporting all of the connectivity and internet needs of those different areas. And so we kind of supplemented the capacity there, but eventually we were overwhelmed and we were forced to move out to the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. If you've never been to Salem or our Public Safety Academy, it is unfortunately kind of in the middle of a signal black hole. It's in a valley and not a lot of cell signal, and it's not served well by internet providers because it was never really intended to be. But we took it in stride, and in about 72 hours, we were able to completely replicate and build out a brand new emergency coordination center at the Public Safety Academy. So what that looked like was the installation of hundreds of phone lines, numerous wireless access points, putting in cellular connectivity. As our CISA Emergency Communications Division Coordinator, Bruce Richter, said, if this had been an exercise inject, the participants would have called it unreasonable and unrealistic. It was certainly exciting. We actually brought in an incident management team from one of our forestry agencies to help us manage and make this transition happen. But to go through it was definitely an experience, but one that I am glad that I have under my belt now, because we got to do some really cool things. We increased the network bandwidth out there. We installed over 150 network drops, 100 plus VoIP phones, 13 conference lines, a number of hotspots and other equipment. We deployed 55 FirstNet cell phones, and as I mentioned, that area is kind of a cellular dead spot. On a given day, they don't have the ability to even make a voice call off a cell tower in that area. And this was completely moving our entire state command and control element to this area. So you can, and all of the media folks. So you can kind of imagine how important the cellular connectivity was for those folks. So we utilized FirstNet and Verizon. We put out 2 cell on light trucks, or COLTs. We brought in network extenders and metro cells. And then we actually stood up an interagency IT services unit, something that we'd never done before. And we brought in different agency IT staff to help their own individual staff and personnel move into this building and kind of stand up operations. As I mentioned, cellular connectivity was a big problem for us. So we worked with the providers to install temporary solutions and COLTs and metro cells and all of these different pieces of equipment to expand those capabilities, because we had everybody from the governor to our lead PIOs, emergency management staff, Oregon Health Authority staff. Our entire, again, command and control section had been moved to this area with no cell phone connectivity. So it was a challenge for us, but it was one that I'm happy to say that we were able to meet very quickly. We were told that we were moving on Friday and to be ready by Monday. So we had a number of personnel from both our internal staff at my agency, DPSST staff that just worked wonders to string miles and miles of line and drop network drops and get everything kind of in place and ready to go Monday morning. It was an incredible feat to be a part of and to watch, and I'm very proud of the teams that did it. Just for kind of a gee whiz sake, there you can kind of see, and it probably is hard to see on your screen, but you can kind of see what our organizational structure looked at that time throughout the state. So from the governor on down into our individual ESFs, lots of people, almost 300 people to move. So it was a very big job. Another mission that we were asked to support was Oregon National Guard's mission to support the Oregon Employment Department. With coronavirus and the effects that we had closing down businesses and restricting the public's ability to go out and do things, we had a number of people laid off and businesses closed, unfortunately, which resulted in an unprecedented number of telephone calls and reach out to Oregon Employment Department, and was resulting in a really long backlog of calls, unfortunately. So the governor made the decision to deploy the National Guard to support the Employment Department. One of the things that we were tasked with is supporting them with a brand new call center. So the room that you are looking at on your screen was previously empty. There's nothing in there. And we were able to put together a 21-seat call center in about 18 hours. It was, again, pretty incredible to see and do and watch, and looking at those Oregon National Guardsmen coming in and really making a difference and getting people help when they needed it the most was very rewarding. Another very large project for us that we supported through ESF2 was the standing up of the Oregon Medical Station, kind of a joint project between the National Guard and our Oregon Health Authority. And this involved taking our state fairgrounds and turning it into a 1,000-bed hospital. Our state fairgrounds was kind of had never been thought of in this way before. It's generally used for fair type events, concerts and trade shows, things like that. And it had some basic internet connectivity. I think they utilized a provider that was kind of providing, staff internet, some guest access, you could view a web page, things like that. But the creation of a hospital kind of required an entirely different sort of network when we really looked at it. We needed doctors to have the ability to look at patient records and transmit information. We needed patients to be able to keep in contact with their families and also be entertained. We needed nurses and other support staff to be able to do what they needed to do. And so what we ended up doing was actually working with CenturyLink to build out new fiber to the building. It wasn't on fiber at that time. They were able to turn that down in about 24 hours, or turn it up in about 24 hours. We deployed a number of network drops and access points throughout 3 of our fairgrounds buildings, a number of VoIP phones, and then worked with our cell providers to assess the coverage in that area and increase it where needed. And we were able to support that facility. We came very close to needing it. Luckily, we did not, and we were able to stand that mission down with no patient seen. So, but those infrastructure upgrades remain. They're part of our plan, as well as the hospital, to support future operations and disasters and emergencies. And those same network infrastructure is currently being utilized at the fairgrounds to support vaccine operations. So it was a good investment. Glad we were able to support those efforts. And then lastly, kind of another thing that we were able to support that was was very rewarding were those things that made people still feel human, and that we could support somewhat of a new normal. with the COVID restrictions in place, one of the things that Oregon normally would pride ourselves on and do with all it would be widely attended was our public safety officer memorial. And this year, or last year, I should say, again, with the COVID restrictions in place, unfortunately, DPSST had to close their campus and wasn't able to hold the traditional memorial ceremony. But with the increased infrastructure in place and some of the improvements that we had made, they were actually still able to hold a full ceremony with the DPSST staff and Emergency Coordination Center staff on site, and they were able to broadcast that out so that families and friends and coworkers and public safety personnel across the state could still virtually participate. Another thing that we were able to do during the emergency is support National Public Safety Telecommunications Week. This was in April, which is, of course, during the height of COVID-19 activity when we first kicked off. And at that time, our 911 dispatchers and centers were not only getting overwhelmed with calls, but also having to face potential outbreaks amongst their own staff. And we had a number of dispatchers get sick. And so we were trying to come up with a way to support them. And we were very lucky to be able to do that through a couple of different ways. We were able to put together a kind of I guess it's a greeting card, but we were able to have hundreds of public safety personnel and emergency coordination center personnel sign and give over to our 911 staff. And then also able to film a thank you video from across the state. So that was pretty cool. And then we were also able to maintain those relationships. The one, I think, silver lining and good part of coming throughout our response to COVID-19, I think for at least my personnel, was the close working relationships that we developed with people like forestry, agencies that folks from the CIO's office typically wouldn't work real closely with, their incident management teams and things like that. And I think that those relationships developed during COVID really helped out during the next emergency that we'll talk about, our fires. Labor Day weekend, we were thrust into an unprecedented, and I don't say that word lightly anymore, but an unprecedented wildfire season. Across Oregon, between about Labor Day and November, we experienced over 2,000 fires and burned over 1.2 million acres. We lost 3,000 plus structures. Unfortunately, we had 11 people killed, including 2 fire suppression personnel. You can see kind of what that map looked like. Obviously, not all of the fires represented there, only the major ones. But for Oregon, this had never happened before. I come from Arizona, and wildfire, of course, is a part of life there. But to see this sort of fire activity in our terrain with our fuel loads was just incredible and scary. And the state was a little bit overwhelmed. We very quickly activated our emergency coordination center and all the state response structures, and stood up for those events. But one of the things that I wanted to share was what it looked like from the Emergency Coordination Center. And I've got a question there. What time of day do you think that these were taken? And I'll give you a hint. They were at opposite times. So the one on your left, I believe, is about 8 p.m. at night, and the one on the right is about 6 a.m. in the morning. And you can see just the light and smoke from those fires that were still, a number of miles away, just how big and kind of overwhelming they were for us, even in downtown Salem. So the fire response was a little bit different than our COVID response. Rather than taking on individual missions, we as an ESF had to look at coordinating the response across a large area to multiple incidents. And instead of taking individual missions, we really looked at communications infrastructure and how we could support those efforts, and then also individual communities and how we could provide support there. So I wanted to provide you a look at some of the damage and situations that we were dealing with. So this is our Mount Hagen radio site, which supports a number of different agencies, fire response agencies, law enforcement, our state network. And you can see that there is nothing left. Everything that you see there is charred to a crisp. These are some photos of the same site. That tower is just barely standing there. They did have to tear part of it down and rebuild it. It's actually, there's two towers on that site, and you can kind of see from the aerial photo just how damaged and destroyed those buildings are and everything around it. But at the same time, you can see kind of how things still happened. This is a temporary repeater that was put up to support local fire efforts very quickly during the incident, and they were able to continue working through and responding to those emergencies. And I can say in just 4 short months that tower was rebuilt, brand new with all of the supporting infrastructure, and is online now. So it was kind of just an amazing project to see that come together. You can see kind of the smoking pile of rubble there that it was on the right-hand side. That's the radio room, and you're looking at a rack that would normally have all sorts of radio equipment in it. To give you kind of an idea of what the conditions are like, I'd like to play a quick video. Okay. So I wanted to give you an idea of what the conditions like were on the ground and how it affected our radio infrastructure. So what you're looking at is an internal camera from our Halls Ridge radio site, a very large site. All the major cellular carriers are on that site, our public safety state radio system, local and county public safety agencies. But you can see kind of how intense this was. Here in just a second, you'll see the flames approach and impinge upon just about everything. It came kind of this towering inferno, for lack of a better term, but almost like a fire tornado here. So you can see as the wind picks up, it just the speed increases, the flame intensity increases, and this is why you saw those fires spread so quickly, and why we were kind of caught so unaware. We went to bed one night, and the next morning had 300 fires on the landscape and so much damage. So Halls Ridge was what you just saw. This is a picture of the aftermath there, taken from a Civil Air Patrol flyover. And on the right side of your screen, you can see one of the mapping tools that we utilize to understand where infrastructure is. And you can see just how much infrastructure sat on that one site. All those little boxes represent different towers and pieces of communications equipment. And to your right, the right of, so this is the tower location that we're talking about and that you're looking at in the PIP photo. But you can see that there are communities that tower serves on and along this highway that were fairly decimated. So another aspect of the ESF II response that I wanted to talk a little bit about was our partnership with the Civil Air Patrol for Imagery. You can imagine with 2,000 fires on the landscape, how many pieces of communications infrastructure were impacted by that, whether they had fiber and power burned off, or whether they themselves burned or were damaged or even undamaged. There were literally hundreds of different sites that individually kind of needed to be assessed and understood how much damage they were. And in some cases, we didn't have any information. So in partnering with the Civil Air Patrol and our Oregon wing, we were able to gain some imagery and help understand where that damage was. one of the challenges that we had was actually getting boots onto the ground to these sites. So, for example, this site that you're looking at right now is very clearly burned over and what we would consider in the burn area. There's some green there, but very clearly in the black. And so all of our mapping shows that that site has burned. And it may or may not be online. And we may or may not have had contact with who ran that particular communication site. So we may or may not know whether or not it's online or offline. But even if it is offline, we don't know why. Did the entire tower burn? Did the supporting structures burn? Was it just a power or backhaul problem? Is it just knocked out of alignment? And in a lot of these places, due to the extensive damage surrounding the cell towers and radio towers, they became almost impossible to access, either due to active fire restrictions, sometimes tens or 20, 30 miles away, might still be blocking the road and you can't get up to them. It might be a terrain problem where we've got debris blocking our way that will take a long time to clear to get somebody up there. In some cases, it was weather. We had continued red flag conditions and rocks falling and things like that. And in some cases, we just didn't have the personnel to actually get out to all these sites. And so that's where we turned to our Civil Air Patrol partners and said, can you help us with this? Can you go out and get imagery of all of these different sites? And that way we can do some remote damage assessment and triage over how bad a site looks and how quickly could we potentially have it back up, or how many of these are truly down for the count. So between discussions with ESF2 and our partners in 12 Energy, Civil Air Patrol was requested to fly remote sensing imagery. We were able to request them under the Stafford Act. And then because of the FEMA declaration, we shared a 25% cost share with FEMA. And you can see some other statistics there. But we also invited the Civil Air Patrol to embed with us in the Emergency Coordination Center. So they were able to provide staffing and manpower for ESF2, as well as carry out this imagery mission for us. Normally, if the CAP was tasked to do this sort of mission on any given day, they would ask us for a list of targets, and they would fly one or more sorties and try and hit as many targets as they could. But because of the widespread nature and size of these fires, a lot of the targets were scattered around fire perimeters, and you can see an example there. I believe that's the Lion's Head fire. Where we had a number of different targets that we really wanted an evaluation of, but what the Civil Air Patrol found was certain flanks of the fire may be active and being fought, which creates a problem in being able to fly in that airspace. The entire incident itself was under a TFR, so they had to work with the FAA to get clearance to fly in there. But what they ended up doing was actually flying some of them individually or as part of other sorties, but they were able to target them and get the photos that we needed. They utilized 3 different systems. The kind of the most resilient and easiest method was an observer with a Nikon camera looking out a specially designed window and taking photos. And this allowed different angles and to get views of up close of antennas and microwave dishes and help us understand, just how damaged the tower was. They utilized a wing strut-mounted VIRB camera system that was able to take some high-resolution photos for us. And then they also experimented using their Waldo strut-mounted system that allowed 3D imagery, so we could kind of really take a look at things like power lines and antenna structures to give us more information about what we're actually looking at. And then, of course, they were able to geotag all of those photos for us and put them on the maps, so we could overlay them with fire perimeter maps and fire behavior maps and really get an idea of what was going on the ground. And so here's some examples of those. This is one that's taken from the handheld Nikon and allows us to really get kind of down and from the side angles and understand, what happened and what's still standing. You can clearly see that the building is destroyed. We've got a number of towers there. pretty easy to say that that's a site that's, kind of in the red. It's going to take us a long time to rebuild. The VIRB photos, much higher resolution. We can kind of get down. They take longer to shoot, and they have to fly a very specific trajectory. But you can definitely see that tower is still standing. Doesn't look like it's really damaged at all, despite the widespread damage around it. And sure enough, that one was fairly easy to get back online. This is an example of the Waldo imagery and some of its capabilities. It almost looks like you're looking at Google Earth, but our target was, of course, there in the red box. So a little bit harder to see when they're flying higher up, but they can actually fly it a second time and from other angles and build a 3D model for us if we needed. This one was very clearly flattened and so kind of gave us a pretty good understanding. We didn't need them to fly it anymore, but just some more examples of what they were able to do. We saw that this one came very close to being in the black, but was fine. We saw this one was actually in the black, but was still fine and still operational. We saw some that were in otherwise completely destroyed areas, but came out okay. And just helped us understand where we were vulnerable and what was going to take a while to get back online and what we could triage and get back up and running. So now we'll transition a little bit and talk about how ESF2 provided direct communication support to some of the communities and first responders. What we brought to the table was, again, our ESF2 coordination calls. We were able to provide some real-time situational awareness for our leadership, as well as personnel employed out in the field. We were able to coordinate requests for communications unit personnel and equipment via EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. That's when we go out of state to look for resources that we don't have in state. So we were able to bring in a number of personnel and equipment from both Washington and California to help respond to the fires. We were able to coordinate some of those incoming commercial and FirstNet cellular assets. The image on your left, very old school, but that was how we were tracking where deployables were and their progress throughout the state. The different colors corresponded to the different carriers, but that allowed us to kind of keep track of where things were as we were moving them around. We could unstick the arrow, move it, and it was low tech, so it maintained and it was easy to maintain. We did some frequency coordination and deconfliction. We brought in somebody from CISA to help with that, and we had numerous incidences that were operating very close together. Some of our pre-programmed caches of equipment were programmed similarly, and so we saw a lot of interference from those, and we had to deconflict that and identify frequencies that they could operate off of without interfering with anybody else. We were able to coordinate those damage assessments with the Civil Air Patrol. And we also provided targeting for infrastructure that hadn't been damaged but needed to be protected directly to incident management teams. So we were able to look at what we had deployed in the field and pick targets that they could defend and keep standing, especially in key critical failure points. We were able to coordinate some of that recovery of communications capabilities in communities that were impacted. And then we did actually do some deployment of state-owned assets. That's not typically an ESF2 responsibility, but because this was so widespread, we actually sent boots on the ground to deploy some things and stand up some resources. Our integrated ESF2 team consisted of our partners from FEMA and CISA, myself from the Department of Administrative Services, some personnel from our CIO's office, the Public Utility Commission co-leads ESF2 with me, and then we had support from our Department of Transportation, Forestry, Emergency Management, our Oregon APCO-NENA 911 Association supported operations, again, Civil Air Patrol, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T embedded with us in our Emergency Coordination Center, either in person or virtually. So we had a person there from those companies that we could call on when we needed something. And then we also got support from the Information Technology Disaster Resource Center, or ITDRC, and then kind of a homegrown volunteer group called Oregon Internet Response, made up of providers here in Oregon that felt like they could really bring their resources to bear and help get some of these communities back up online, and they had a lot of success. So this is an example of one of the things that we were able to do, and that's provide radio-like capabilities via FirstNet push-to-talk, deploying state-owned cradle points, cell phones, and hotspots to incident management teams to increase their situational awareness, where their personnel were, and then in areas that had communications infrastructure destroyed, we were able to utilize cell-on light trucks or cell-on wheels, colts and cows, to provide some of that capability via cellular LTE. We had one particular community that represented kind of a very large communications challenge for us in the McKenzie River corridor. This area was hit particularly hard from a communications perspective because a lot of infrastructure burned, but there were a number of people and structures that remained standing. You can see on the screen where the fire burned, and to the right on the screen, there are several communities who rely on infrastructure in the burned area. So we had lots of people still there, still in their homes, still trying to go about their lives, but were suddenly cut off from the world. We had miles of fiber burned. We had some very key critical pieces of infrastructure that were destroyed. Lots of cell towers and radio infrastructure that was impacted. COVID-19 concerns still at the time. There was a school that still needed to operate in the area and was trying to teach virtually. Access was a problem. A lot of the roads were still impacted with debris. And then terrain and topography. This is a very rugged area. Lots of hills, lots of mountaintops, ridges, valleys. So it made providing coverage and capacity over large areas very difficult. One piece of key infrastructure that was destroyed was the Blue River Central Office. For those of you that aren't familiar with what a central office is, it's the piece of infrastructure that basically provides telephone and potentially broadband connectivity to an entire area. It's where the network terminates and then goes out into the community. This particular central office served all of those small areas and is not something that can be very easily replaced. In fact, that CO has still not been rebuilt as of today that I'm aware of. So it's a very long-term infrastructure impact that we had in the area. And so supporting this sort of outage, this sort of problem was a new one for us in disaster response. How do we support communications for an entire community as opposed to just supporting it for first responders, right? And so what we focused on was developing community connectivity bubbles. That way we could support access to 911, critical points of sale for food and fuel and other necessities, access to healthcare. The local clinic was burned up and was actually operating out of a basketball training facility summer camp that they have for high school kids. But being able to support them and still seeing patients and providing healthcare for that community during COVID-19. And then providing opportunities for education. There's several schools impacted, including the high school. How do they keep teaching? This was in September and October when the school year had just kicked off. So how did we keep them going? And the answer was by building these connectivity bubbles. On the right there, you can see that this is how we were handling 911 at one point, where we had ambulances stationed, had an old quilt shop, and they would actually patrol the neighborhood for people to flag them down if they were having a medical emergency. So just imagine that your loved one is sitting at home, has a medical emergency, and you have to go out and find an EMS provider or drive them, almost 100 miles into town to get help. So that was a big challenge for us. And what we tried to do is, again, create these connectivity bubbles, recognizing that we couldn't provide the level of service that we really needed to across this wide area. So this was kind of how we addressed that. So FEMA MERS responded, and were able to put up a couple of call centers that allowed people to go and access internet and register for public assistance and make telephone calls and use internet. We deployed a number of different pieces of equipment out into the community, cradle points and hotspots. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a community recovery center where impacted individuals could come and get clothing or food or needed items. We were able to put in some temporary Wi-Fi there, operating off of colts and cows that allowed people to come in and make a telephone call or download a homework assignment or surf the internet for a minute. So we were able to kind of consolidate those areas a little bit. One real big success story that we had was with Oregon Internet Response. Again, that kind of loosely affiliated group of broadband and internet providers from throughout Oregon and even personnel here in Washington. They were able to kind of come together very quickly during the emergency and say, how can we help? And utilizing a home-built microwave network, they were able to put out these internet boxes that you can see on the left-hand side of your screen to, again, provide some connectivity for things like point of sale and learning and education. And those boxes really took some of the load off of our satellite-based resources that are not normally able to support those sorts of things and are very expensive and inefficient to operate. But we were able to, again, work with some of the cell providers to provide some of that connectivity. On the right side of your screen is another community recovery center that they were actually operating out of school. So we were able to work with Verizon and FirstNet to put in different hotspots there so that they could actually have school off of a cell on light truck, which is, again, something that we don't normally see during disasters. Typically, cows and colts are there to support public safety, but this was really a community response effort. Some more examples there. I love the picture. These two I took are at the quilt shop. They turned into a temporary EMS station. The fire station actually burned down there, so they housed a couple of different EMS units out of the quilt shop. And this was the search and rescue set up their communication system for them. But I love it. Low key or low tech, and got the job done. They ran a radio out the window. You can kind of see the cabling there out to an antenna strapped to a T-post there. So I love the ingenuity, and it was definitely a how can we get this done moment for them. And by doing that, they were able to continue at least a connection back to dispatch there. So it was pretty cool. And then finally, I just wanted to share some of the considerations and lessons learned that I had out of responding to both the pandemic and the fire. PACE planning, I think most of the people in this audience are familiar with what PACE planning is, but having a primary, an alternate, a contingency, and an emergency plan for everything that you possibly can. What's the backup? What is going to work if this doesn't work? Have that plan in place, have options. When we think about an emergency, what's the worst can happen? And then what's the worst that can happen when the worst happens? So have those alternative methods. I also learned that there really needs to be cross-governmental and interagency communications coordination. I think we started off some of the incidents where at least in the past, that coordination had not occurred. And communications typically is something that is only thought of when it goes bad. And if you're not coordinating ahead of time, if we have any incident management team members in the audience or incident commanders or planning team members, plan for that coordination ahead of time, because if you involve your communications folks in the planning cycle and get them to the table early, it can make your life a lot easier. And that needs to be, again, cross-governmental, interagency communications coordination. Need for continued partnerships with telecommunications, cellular, and infrastructure providers. We could not have done almost anything that we were able to do without the support of our providers, our telecommunications, our cellular, and our infrastructure providers. CenturyLink, Lumen, Ziply, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Oregon Telephone Association, Pioneer, Comcast, Xfinity, you name it. They were there and helping and trying to figure out how to meet these needs. And we could not have done that without them. Our VOADs and NGOs, we had a lot of support from ITDRC and Oregon Internet Response. And one of the lessons learned that we learned them and with them is that we need to focus on working to integrate them into our team and sync our efforts with the formal response agencies. If we don't, sometimes we end up targeting the same problems and wasting resources. So having those close working relationships with VOADs and NGOs and volunteer groups in place ahead of time speeds up the response so much during the incident and really gets them on task immediately. So those pre-existing relationships are key. If you think the call is going to come in the incident and you don't know the person who's going to be making the call, that call is probably not going to get made because we don't know who to call. So reach out, make a relationship, have a meeting, get coffee, whatever you need to do, but have those relationships together ahead of time. Another key point that we learned, that training, especially ICS, is paramount and cannot be overemphasized. We had some volunteers and dignitaries and elected officials who hadn't really ever heard of ICS and didn't understand how we operate in an incident world, and that curve of getting people caught up and on the same working page, using the same terminology. It just takes time. So getting that training ahead of time, again, is paramount. Cannot be overemphasized. We actually have a bill within the Oregon State Legislature right now that would call for all senior leadership and elected officials to take that training and then also provide some resources for providing that training out to others. Cannot stress that enough. If you haven't taken your ICS classes and you're going to be involved in response or recovery efforts, go get it. Go get that training. It's free. It's online. Go take it. And then also, kind of related to that, we do not have enough communications unit or information technology services unit people in place. So if your state or your agency or your county is going to offer a ComU, ComL, ComT, ITSL, any of those positions, OxCom, take the training, go get the position task book signed off, get your credentials and get trained up because we need more people in those positions. Pre-stage response equipment, very helpful, can save lives. Travel time during an emergency is those sorts of minutes are a lot longer than normal minutes, when you're waiting for something to get in place. So, if you're a response agency or a county level government person or anything like that, and you've got the ability to pre-stage equipment, that can very, very much help. Simplifying systems aids in creating the ability to replicate success. the things that we learned in COVID that we were able to simplify and templatize helped us in the fires tremendously, because we already had those tools in place. We had a mechanism for situational reports. We had a mechanism for information sharing. We had a mechanism for the ESF2 coordination calls, all things that we had built during our COVID-19 response. And we were able to employ those during the wildfires. It just made us that much more effective. So what do you use during your everyday mission that you can simplify and have ready to go in an emergency? And identifying those things and packaging them up so that they are ready to go and be able to be used, forms, policies, procedures, tasks, anything like that, that you can write down, get in place, and have a plan for and practice on is key. Another lesson that we learned out the hard way was that equipment caches, even the national cache, runs out. We very quickly had a need for a large number of portable radios within Oregon, hundreds. And of course, our first call was to the National Fire Cache. And because of not only the fires in Oregon, but also Washington and California, they were essentially out. And so what's the backup plan? And we're very lucky that we were able to reach out to other states and they were able to help us. But have that plan in place. If your normal place where you get equipment runs out or isn't able to meet your needs, what's the backup plan? And then I think one of the lessons that I learned personally was that we need to remember to stop and focus on what matters most. I think some of the most profound and impactful moments of my career were during COVID and these fires, and just seeing how communities respond to emergencies, seeing how families and friends and neighbors and community members support each other. That was very incredible to me. And so I think that during these incidents, one of the things that we have to do, even for just a moment, is to stop and focus on those silver linings and what really matters most. We're all in this together. Don't be afraid to ask questions and or for help. When COVID-19 kicked off, I had been the SWIC for all of about 4 months. And I had lots of questions and lots of need for help and guidance. And luckily, I've got 55 peer SWICs and supporting personnel from CISA, DHS, and some great mentors here in the state. But don't be afraid to ask those questions and ask for help or guidance, or how do you do it? Can I steal how you do it and make it my own? But the key to all this is having those relationships. And one of the taglines that I've stolen from the North Carolina SWIC, Mr. Greg Hauser, is interoperability is, in the end, nothing more than relationships, and developing those and having good contacts and knowing people in other sectors and across the government or across agencies or organizations. In the end, it's all about relationships, and so develop them early. But that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for being with me throughout here, and I'm happy to take questions now.